The chainsaw's roar echoed across the valley as Margaret Whitmore watched 30 years of her life's work collapse in splinters. But as she stood there, dirt-stained and trembling with rage, she didn't know that her vindictive neighbor had just made the most expensive mistake of her life. Sometimes revenge isn't about getting even. It's about buying justice, 1 acre at a time. The morning sun painted the Texas Hill Country in shades of gold and amber, casting long shadows across the pristine pastures of Whitmore Ranch. Margaret Whitmore stood on her wraparound porch, coffee mug warming her calloused hands, watching her prize Angus cattle graze peacefully in the distance. At 62, she had built this ranch from nothing. 500 acres of prime Texas land that she'd scraped and saved for since she was 25 years old. The sound hit her like a physical blow. The angry buzz of a chainsaw ripped through. The morning calm, followed by the sharp crack of splintering wood. Margaret's coffee mug shattered on the porch boards as she sprinted toward the eastern fence line, her boots pounding against the packed earth. No, 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 she screamed, but the mechanical roar drowned out her voice. There, standing in a cloud of sawdust and debris, was Victoria Ashford, her neighbor from hell. The 40-something socialite wore designer work gloves and safety goggles that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Her perfectly styled blonde hair was pulled back in a ponytail that somehow managed to look effortless and expensive at the same time. Victoria's chainsaw carved through another post of Margaret's century-old cedar fence with surgical precision. The fence that had stood between their properties since 1924. The fence that had been surveyed, documented, and legally established decades before either woman was born. Victoria! Stop! Margaret's voice cracked with desperation. Victoria shut off the chainsaw and turned, pulling off her safety goggles with theatrical flair. Her ice-blue eyes sparkled with malicious satisfaction. Oh, Margaret! I didn't see you there. What the hell do you think you're doing? Improving the view, Victoria said, gesturing grandly toward the destruction. This ugly old fence was blocking my sight line to the valley. My architect says removing it will add at least $200,000 to my property value. Margaret stared at the devastation. 30 feet of fence lay in ruins, cedar posts that had weathered a century. Of Texas storms now reduced to kindling. Her cattle were already beginning to wander toward the gap, confused and agitated. That fence is on MY property line, Margaret said, her voice deadly quiet. You just destroyed MY fence. Victoria laughed, a sound like crystal breaking. Actually, sweetie, I had it surveyed. My surveyor says this fence has been encroaching on my land for decades. I'm just reclaiming what's rightfully mine. Your surveyor is wrong. I have the original deed, the county records. Well, my surveyor has a PhD from UT and 20 years of experience. Who are you going to trust, some old papers or modern science? Victoria picked up the chainsaw again. Besides, I'm not done. Yet. This whole section needs to come down. She yanked the starter cord, and the chainsaw roared back to life. Margaret felt something break inside her chest. Not her heart, that had been broken too many times by life already. This was something deeper. Her foundation. Her faith in fairness, in property rights, in the basic decency that should exist between neighbors. She watched Victoria destroy another 10 feet of fence, her mind reeling. This wasn't about property lines or sight lines. This was about power. Victoria Ashford, the tech mogul's widow who'd bought the adjacent property 2 years ago for $20 million, had decided that what she wanted mattered more than the law, more than history, more than Margaret's rights. I'm calling the sheriff, Margaret shouted over the chainsaw noise. Victoria shut off the saw again, smirking. Go ahead. Sheriff Hawkins and I just had dinner last week at the country club. Lovely man. We talked about my plans for developing this area. She gestured broadly with one gloved hand. Big plans. Plans that could bring a lot of jobs and tax revenue to the county. The threat was crystal clear. Margaret's stomach clenched with the realization that she wasn't just fighting a neighbor. She was fighting someone with connections, influence, and unlimited resources. You can't just, I can do whatever I want, Margaret. That's what money means in this world. Victoria's voice turned silky with condescension. Maybe it's time you faced reality. This isn't your grandfather's Texas anymore. Progress doesn't wait for sentimental old ranchers clinging to the past. Margaret's hands clenched into fists. My family built this ranch from nothing. We've been here for 4 generations, and I'll be here for the next 4. Victoria started the chainsaw again. Unless you want to sell, I'd be happy to make you an offer. Fair market value, of course. The implication hung in the air like, smoke, sell, or watch your life's work get destroyed piece by piece. Margaret turned and walked away, her legs shaking with rage and humiliation. Behind her, the chainsaw resumed its hungry roar, eating away at everything she'd worked to build and protect. In her kitchen, she dialed 911 with trembling fingers. Sheriff's Department, this is Deputy Martinez. This is Margaret Whitmore out on Ranch Road 447. My neighbor is destroying my fence with a chainsaw. I need someone out here now. Is this a property dispute? No, this is destruction of private property. She's cutting down my fence. A pause. We'll send someone out when we can. Might be a few hours though. We've got a situation. In town. Margaret hung up and stared out her kitchen window. Victoria was methodically working her way down the fence line, destroying a century of boundary markers with each cut. Her cattle were wandering freely now, confused and frightened by the noise. She tried calling her lawyer, but got voicemail. She tried the county courthouse, but they were closed until Monday. Every official channel she could think of led to the same dead end, bureaucracy that moved at a snail's pace while her property rights disappeared in real time. By the time Sheriff Hawkins arrived 4 hours later, Victoria was gone and 47 fence posts lay in ruins. The lawman was a pleasant-faced man in his 50s who listened to Margaret's story with what seemed like genuine sympathy. I understand your frustration, Mrs. Whitmore, he said, taking notes on a small pad. But property disputes are complicated. Mrs. Ashford says her surveyor found discrepancies in the fence line placement. Her surveyor is wrong. I have documentation going back to the original land grant. Well, that's something you'll need to work out in court. In the meantime, I can't arrest someone for what might be a legitimate boundary correction. Margaret stared at him. She destroyed my fence. That's criminal mischief at minimum. If the fence was on her property, it wasn't. Sheriff Hawkins closed his notepad with a gentle smile that didn't reach his eyes. Like I said, that's for the courts to decide. I'd recommend getting your own surveyor out here and filing a civil complaint. After he left, Margaret stood alone among the wreckage of a fence, watching her cattle wander aimlessly across what used to be clearly defined property lines. The sun was setting, painting the sky the color of old blood. That night, she sat at her kitchen table with a bottle of bourbon and a stack of legal documents that went back 5 generations. Land grants, surveys, tax records, deeds. Proof upon proof that the fence Victoria had destroyed marked the legitimate boundary between their properties. But proof, she realized, meant nothing without the power to enforce it. At midnight, her phone rang. Mrs. Whitmore. This is Tom Brennan from Brennan & Associates. I represent Mrs. Ashford. Margaret's blood turned to ice. What do you want? Mrs. Ashford asked me to call and discuss a resolution to today's unfortunate misunderstanding. She's prepared to compensate you for any inconvenience, and she'd like to extend an offer to purchase your property. My property isn't for sale. Mrs. Whitmore, litigation is expensive and time-consuming. Mrs. Ashford is prepared to offer you $3.7 million for your 500 acres. That's well above market value. My property isn't for sale, Margaret repeated. I understand emotional attachment, but let's be practical. Mrs. Ashford has resources that you simply don't. She can afford to fight this battle for years. Can you? The line went quiet except for the sound of Margaret's breathing. Think about it, Brennan continued. This could be a fresh start for you. A chance to retire comfortably instead of fighting a battle you can't win. Margaret hung up without another word. She poured another bourbon and stared out at her land, at the pastures her grandfather had cleared by hand, at the barn her father had built board by board, at the life she'd sacrificed everything to preserve and protect. Victoria Ashford thought money was power. She thought wealth meant she could take whatever she wanted, destroy whatever stood in her way, and buy her way out of any consequences. Margaret smiled grimly and reached for her laptop. If Victoria wanted to play the money game, then it was time to learn the rules. 3 hours later, she closed the computer and leaned back in her chair. The bourbon bottle was empty, but her mind had never been clearer. Victoria Ashford had made one crucial mistake. She assumed that a small-town rancher wouldn't have the resources or the connections to fight back. But Margaret Whitmore wasn't just any rancher. She was the granddaughter of Oil W.I. Harold Jackson arrived at dawn in a dust-covered pickup truck that had seen better decades. At 73, he was one of the last of the old-school landmen, the guys who could read geological surveys like sheet music and spot oil potential in terrain that looked worthless to everyone else. He'd worked with Margaret's father for 30 years before retiring, and he still owed the Whitmore family more favors than he could count. "Coffee's on," Margaret called from the porch as Harold climbed out of his truck, moving with the careful deliberation of a man whose joints had been protesting for the past decade. "Better be stronger than last time," he grumbled, but his weathered face cracked into a grin. "Maggie, you look like hell." "Feel worse." She handed him a steaming mug. As they settled into the porch rockers that had belonged to her grandparents. "Thanks for coming out so early." Harold's sharp blue eyes surveyed the destroyed fence line. "That's a mess, all right. Your daddy would have shot someone for that." "Different times." "Maybe. Maybe not." He pulled a manila folder from his jacket. "You asked me to dig up everything I could find on the Ashford property. Took me all night, but what I found is interesting." Margaret's pulse quickened. "Tell me." "Well, first off, your neighbor paid $20 million for 847 acres 2 years ago. Previous owner was the Castellanos family, had it for 3 generations. Used it mostly for cattle. I remember the Castellanos. Good people. They were hurting bad financially. Drought hit them hard, cattle prices dropped, medical bills from old Manuel's cancer treatment. They were facing foreclosure when Mrs. Ashford swooped in with a cash offer. 20 million seems high for grazing land." Harold's grin widened. "That's what I thought. So I did some digging into why someone would pay premium price for seemingly ordinary ranch land." He opened the folder and pulled out a geological survey map covered in colored markings. "Turns out your neighbor didn't just buy land, Maggie. She bought what's underneath it." Margaret leaned forward, studying the map. "Oil." "Better. Natural gas. Lots of it." Harold pointed to a series of red marks on the survey. "See these formations? That's the Eagle Ford Shale running right through her property. Conservative estimates put the recoverable natural gas reserves at around 40 million cubic feet." Margaret's coffee mug stopped halfway to her lips. 40 million. At current market prices, we are talking about potential revenue of $60 to $80 million over the next 15 years. Maybe more if prices keep climbing. The numbers hit Margaret like a physical blow. Victoria Ashford hadn't bought a ranch, she'd bought a gold mine. No wonder she was so confident, so dismissive of local law enforcement and property rights. She wasn't just wealthy, she was sitting on a fortune that dwarfed anything the local community could imagine. But here's where it gets interesting. Harold continued, pulling out another document. "I called my buddy at the Railroad Commission, had him pull all the drilling permits and lease agreements for the area. Guess what I found?" "What?" "Mrs. Ashford has been quietly trying to secure drilling rights for the entire valley. She's already got lease agreements with 4 other property owners, and she's been putting pressure on 3 more. Harold's finger traced a pattern on the map. "But there's one problem with her plan." Margaret studied the survey, her mind racing. The formation extends beyond her property. Bingo! The richest part of the gas deposit runs right under the boundary line between her land and yours. She can't access it without drilling rights to your property. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The destroyed fence, the bogus property survey, the intimidation tactics, the generous buyout offer, it all made perfect sense now. "She's trying to steal my land because she needs it for drilling access," Margaret said. "More than that." Harold pulled out a third document. "I had my surveyor buddy take a look at the geological data. The optimal drilling site for the entire formation? It's about 200 yards inside your property line." Margaret stared at the survey map, her mind reeling. Victoria Ashford wasn't just a vindictive neighbor. She was a predator who'd identified Margaret's ranch as the key to unlocking a fortune, and she was willing to use any means necessary to take it. "There's more," Harold said quietly. "I did some research on Mrs. Ashford herself. Turns out she's not quite the grieving widow she pretends to be." He handed Margaret a printed article from a Dallas business journal. The headline read, "Tech. Mogul's widow faces federal investigation. Margaret skimmed the article, her anger building with each paragraph. Victoria Ashford was under investigation by the SEC for insider trading related to her late husband's energy investments. The federal probe had frozen most of her liquid assets, leaving her cash poor despite her apparent wealth. She's broke, Margaret said. Leverage broke. She's got assets worth hundreds of millions, but she can't access the cash. The natural gas play isn't just about getting richer, it's about staying solvent while the feds investigate her finances. So she's desperate. Desperate people do stupid things. Harold closed the folder and leaned back in his rocker. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Margaret stood and walked to the porch railing, looking out over her land with new eyes. For the first time since Victoria's chainsaw had shattered her morning peace, she felt something other than helpless rage. Harold, how much would it cost to buy the Ashford property? Harold nearly choked on his coffee. What? She paid $20 million 2 years ago. With the federal investigation and her cash flow problems, what do you think she'd take now? Maggie, even if she'd sell, which she won't, where would you get $20 million? Margaret turned to face him, and Harold saw something in her expression that reminded him powerfully of her father. Remember the Spindletop lease my great-grandfather bought in 1952? Harold's eyes widened. The one everyone said was worthless because it was too far from the main field. That one. Turns out great-granddad was ahead of his time. Modern extraction techniques have made those old worthless leases very valuable. Margaret smiled grimly. I got an offer last month from Devon Energy. $47 million for the mineral rights to 12,000 acres in East Texas. Jesus Christ, Maggie. You never said, I never had a reason to sell before. She pulled her phone from her pocket. But I do now. Harold watched in amazement as Margaret scrolled through her contacts. You're serious about this? Dead serious. Victoria Ashford thinks she can intimidate me because she has money and connections. But she made one crucial mistake. What's that? She assumed I was just some poor old rancher who couldn't fight back. Margaret found the number she was looking for and hit dial. She doesn't know that I come from a family of people who've been playing the long game in Texas energy for 4 generations. The phone rang twice before a crisp voice answered. Devon Energy, Acquisition Department, Janet Morrison speaking. Ms. Morrison, this is Margaret Whitmore. We discussed the Spindletop mineral rights last month. Mrs. Whitmore. Yes, of course. Have you reconsidered our offer? I have. But I need to move quickly. How fast can you close? A pause. For a deal of this magnitude? If you're serious about accepting our $47 million offer, we could have contracts ready by Monday. And close by the end of the week. I'm serious. But I have one condition. What's that? I need the money in a form that I can immediately reinvest in land acquisition. Can you arrange a simultaneous closing where the proceeds go directly into an escrow account for another property purchase? Certainly. We do that all the time. What property are you looking to acquire? Margaret looked out at Victoria's mansion in the distance, its pretentious glass and steel architecture glinting in the morning sun like a middle finger extended toward the Texas sky. The Ashford Ranch. 847 acres adjacent to my current property. Harold was staring at her with his mouth open. I see, Janet said. That's ambitious. Do you have reason to believe the current owner is interested in selling? She will be. After Margaret hung up, Harold shook his head in wonder. Maggie, that woman destroyed 30 feet of fence. You're planning to buy her entire ranch out from under her. She started this fight, Harold. She thought she could bully me because she has money and I don't. She was wrong on both counts. But even if you buy her land, she still knows about the gas deposits. She could try to lease drilling rights from you. Margaret's smile was sharp, as broken glass. Not if she's in federal prison for insider trading. Harold raised an eyebrow. You think she's actually guilty? I think desperate people make mistakes. And I think someone with Victoria's arrogance leaves a paper trail. Margaret pulled out her phone again. I also think the FBI would be very interested to know that she's been using potentially illegal funds to manipulate local property markets. She dialed another number. FBI Financial Crimes Division, Agent Sullivan speaking. Agent Sullivan. My name is Margaret Whitmore, and I have information about Victoria Ashford's recent real estate activities that I believe are relevant to your ongoing investigation. Harold watched in fascination as Margaret systematically laid out everything she'd learned: the suspicious cash purchase, the aggressive land acquisition campaign, the apparent market manipulation designed to force out local property owners. I see, Agent Sullivan said. And you have documentation of these acts. Victoria Ashford stood in her climate-controlled wine cellar, her manicured fingers wrapped around a glass of Chateau Margaux that cost more than most people's monthly salary. The underground space was a sanctuary, 1,200 square feet, of temperature-controlled perfection that housed a collection worth over $2 million. When the stress of managing her late husband's empire became overwhelming, she retreated here to think. Today, she needed to think very carefully indeed. Her phone buzzed with a text from her lawyer. FBI agents at the courthouse asking questions about your property acquisitions. Call me immediately. Victoria's grip tightened on the wine glass. She'd expected this, the federal investigation into her finances had been dragging on for 8 months, casting a shadow over everything she did. But the timing was problematic. She was so close to securing the drilling rights that would solve all her problems. The Whitmore woman's defiance yesterday had been an annoyance, nothing more. Victoria had crushed bigger obstacles than some sentimental old rancher clinging to family land. A few more weeks of pressure, maybe another legal challenge or two, and Margaret Whitmore would crack like all the others. Her phone rang. Tom Brennan's name appeared on the screen. Please tell me you have good news, Victoria said. I wish I did. Brennan's usually confident voice carried an edge of worry. The FBI agent spent 3 hours at the courthouse pulling records on every property transaction you've made in the past 2 years. They're specifically asking about funding sources and whether you used insider information to target properties. Victoria felt ice water in her veins. That's impossible. I was careful. They know about the geological surveys, Victoria. Someone gave them detailed information about the gas deposits and your drilling plans. Who? The Castellanos family doesn't even know what they sold me. I don't know, but whoever it was had access to railroad commission data, mineral rights records, and your private surveyor reports. This isn't some disgruntled neighbor making noise. This is someone with resources and connections. Victoria set down her wine glass with trembling fingers. Margaret Whitmore. The rancher. Come on, Victoria. She's nobody. Then how do you explain this? Yesterday she was just an obstacle. Today the FBI is crawling all over my business. That's not a coincidence. Through her wine cellar small window, Victoria could see across the valley to the Whitmore ranch. The damaged fence line was clearly visible, a testament to her power over her neighbors. But as she watched, she noticed something that made her blood chill. There were vehicles at the Whitmore house. Expensive vehicles. A black SUV with government plates. A pickup truck that looked like it belonged to someone in the oil business. And parked beside Margaret's old Ford was a silver Mercedes that Victoria recognized. Tom, isn't that Janet Morrison's car? Who? Janet Morrison from Devon Energy. She's parked at the Whitmore ranch. A long pause. Why would Devon Energy be meeting with a cattle rancher? Victoria ended the call and grabbed her binoculars from the wine rack. Through the powerful lenses, she could see figures moving around the Whitmore property. Men in suits taking photographs, someone in work clothes examining the fence line, and Margaret Whitmore herself standing on her porch talking animatedly. With a woman in a business suit. The woman turned, and Victoria got a clear look at her face. Janet Morrison, Devon Energy's Chief Acquisition Officer. One of the most aggressive land buyers in Texas. No, Victoria whispered. No, no, no. She ran up the stairs 2 at a time, her designer heels clicking on the limestone steps. In her office, she frantically searched through her files until she found the geological survey that had started this whole venture. Her finger traced the property lines on the map, following the gas formation beneath the ground. The richest part of the deposit didn't just run under her land. It originated on the Whitmore property. If Margaret Whitmore had access to the same geological data, if she understood what she was sitting on. Victoria's hand shook as she reached for her phone. She dialed a number she hadn't called in 6 months. Morrison here. Janet, it's Victoria Ashford. I need to know if you're currently in negotiations with any property owners in my area. A pause that lasted too long. Victoria, I can't discuss confidential business. Cut the bullshit, Janet. I can see your car from my window. You're at the Whitmore Ranch right now. Another pause. Victoria, I think we should talk. Damn right we should talk. Whatever Margaret Whitmore is offering you, I can beat it. It's not about beating offers. Mrs. Whitmore contacted us about selling mineral rights to her East Texas holdings. $47 million worth of proven reserves. Victoria felt the floor drop out from under her. Her East Texas holdings. Apparently, the Whitmore family has been accumulating mineral rights for decades. Mrs. Whitmore is liquidating those assets to fund a land acquisition project. Janet's voice carried a note of professional admiration. Frankly, it's one of the smartest plays I've seen in years. She's trading proven but geographically inconvenient reserves for strategic, local holdings with enormous development potential. What land acquisition project? I really can't. What land acquisition project? She's buying your ranch, Victoria. The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. She sank into her desk chair, the room spinning around her. She can't buy my ranch. My ranch isn't for sale. According to our research, you're facing significant liquidity issues due to the federal investigation. Mrs. Whitmore is prepared to offer cash, and she can close quickly. Janet's voice was briskly professional now. Honestly, Victoria, it might be your best option. The FBI investigation is spooking a lot of potential business partners. Victoria hung up and stared at her reflection in the dark computer screen. Somewhere in the past 24 hours, she'd lost control of the situation completely. The helpless rancher she'd been terrorizing had somehow transformed into a predator stalking her. Her intercom buzzed. Mrs. Ashford. There are 2 FBI agents. Here to see you. Victoria closed her eyes and tried to think. She needed time, needed to understand how Margaret Whitmore had turned the tables so completely. But the federal agents weren't going to give her time. Send them in. Agent Sullivan and Rodriguez were younger than she'd expected, dressed in unremarkable suits that probably cost less than Victoria's shoes. But their eyes held the flat competence of people who'd made careers out of unraveling financial crimes. Mrs. Ashford, thank you for meeting with us, Agent Sullivan said. We have some questions about your recent real estate activities. I assume this is about the ongoing investigation into my late husband's business practices. Partially. We are also interested in your land acquisition strategy in Hill Country. Specifically, we'd like to understand how you identified properties with valuable mineral rights and whether you used insider information to target those acquisitions. Victoria's lawyer had coached her for this moment. Admit nothing, deflect everything, demand documentation for every accusation. I'm not sure what you mean. I bought ranch land because I wanted to live in the country. Agent Rodriguez opened a folder and spread documents across Victoria's mahogany desk. Geological surveys, mineral rights databases, correspondence with drilling companies, all the evidence of her carefully planned strategy to corner the natural gas market in the valley. Mrs. Ashford, these documents suggest a coordinated effort to identify and acquire properties based on subsurface mineral rights. The timing of these acquisitions coincides suspiciously with changes in natural gas prices that your late husband's trading algorithms predicted weeks in advance. Victoria stared at the papers, her mind racing. She'd been so careful, used so many layers of legal protection. How had they assembled this much evidence? Furthermore, Agent Sullivan continued. We have recorded conversations with your attorney attempting to coerce local property owners into selling below market value. We also have documentation of property damage intended to intimidate neighbors into selling. They had Margaret's recording of the phone call. They had witnesses to the fence destruction. Somehow, in less than 24 hours, Margaret Whitmore had assembled a federal case against her. I think I need to speak with my attorney. Of course. But Mrs. Ashford, I should mention that cooperation at this stage could significantly affect how we proceed. Agent Rodriguez leaned forward. We are not just looking at insider trading anymore. We are looking at racketeering, extortion, and conspiracy to manipulate local property markets. Victoria's throat felt like sandpaper. What kind of cooperation? Full disclosure of your land acquisition strategy, including any use of insider information, documentation of all attempts to pressure local property owners, and Agent Sullivan paused meaningfully, your agreement to cease all activities that could be construed as market manipulation. The message was clear. Stop trying to force Margaret Whitmore to sell or face federal racketeering charges. I need time to consider this. Of course. But Mrs. Ashford. Agent Rodriguez stood and collected the documents. Time is something you're running short of. Your liquid assets are frozen, your credit lines are being reviewed, and now we have evidence of ongoing criminal activity. I'd recommend moving quickly. After the agents left, Victoria sat alone in her office, staring out at the Whitmore Ranch. The black SUV. Margaret Whitmore stood in the conference room of Brennan and Associates, wearing her best black suit and the pearl necklace her grandmother had left her. Across the polished mahogany table sat Tom Brennan, Victoria's high-powered attorney, looking like a man who'd spent the night drinking coffee and contemplating career changes. Mrs. Whitmore, Brennan began, his usually commanding voice subdued. I want to thank you for agreeing to this meeting. I'm here as a courtesy, Mr. Brennan. Your client destroyed my property and tried to intimidate me into selling my land. The only reason we are talking instead of seeing each other in court is because I believe in giving people a chance to do the right thing. Brennan loosened his tie, a tell that Margaret recognized from decades of dealing with lawyers, bankers, and oil executives. He was nervous, which meant Victoria's position was even worse than Margaret had hoped. My client is prepared to offer full compensation for the fence repairs, plus punitive damages for your inconvenience. She's also willing to sign a binding agreement to respect all existing property boundaries. Margaret smiled politely. That's generous. What's she asking for in return? She'd like to purchase mineral rights to your property. She's prepared to offer $15 million. The number hung in the air between them. 3 days ago, $15 million would have been more money than Margaret could have imagined owning. Today, it was insulting. Mr. Brennan, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm not here to sell mineral rights to your client. I'm here to buy her ranch. Brennan's carefully composed expression cracked. Excuse me. The Ashford property, 847 acres. I'm prepared to offer $18 million, cash, with a 10-day closing. Mrs. Whitmore, the Ashford ranch is not for sale. Margaret opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. Mr. Brennan, I think you should review these documents before making any definitive statements about what is or isn't for sale. She slid the folder across the table. Brennan opened it with the reluctance of a man expecting bad news. His face went pale as he read the first page, then the second, then frantically shuffled through the entire stack. Where did you get these? Public records, mostly. Amazing what you can find when you know where to look and have the right connections. Margaret leaned back in her chair, watching Brennan's growing horror. Did you know that your client has been operating on margin loans secured by properties she doesn't fully own? Or that her offshore accounts, the ones she thought were hidden from the federal investigation, have been frozen by Interpol? The documents told a story of financial desperation hidden behind a facade of wealth. Victoria Ashford wasn't just cash poor, she was leveraged to the breaking point, using complex financial instruments to maintain her lifestyle while her actual assets were tied up in legal proceedings. The really interesting part, Margaret continued, is the acceleration clause in her primary mortgage. If she's charged with any federal crime, the entire balance becomes due immediately. $23 million, payable within 30 days. Brennan's hand shook as he read the mortgage documents. How do you have access to private financial records? I don't. These are all public filings, court documents, and regulatory submissions. It just takes knowing which agencies to ask and having relationships with people who've been working in Texas finance for 50 years. Margaret smiled grimly. Your client made the mistake of assuming I was some ignorant country bumpkin. She didn't realize that my family has been playing this game since before she was born. Brennan closed the folder and stared at Margaret with something approaching respect. What exactly are you proposing? Simple. Mrs. Ashford sells me her ranch for $18 million. I'll structure the deal to pay off her acceleration clause and leave her with enough cash to start over somewhere else. In exchange, she drops all claims to my property, makes full restitution for the fence damage, and agrees never to return to this county. And if she refuses? Margaret's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in her eyes. Then, I'll buy her ranch at the foreclosure auction for about $6 million, and she can spend the next decade in federal prison thinking about what might have been. Brennan was quiet for a long moment, studying Margaret with the careful attention of a lawyer recognizing a superior opponent. You're not bluffing. I never bluff, Mr. Brennan. It's a waste of time and energy. My client thinks she can fight this. She has resources, had resources. Past tense. Margaret stood and collected her briefcase. I'll give you until Friday to respond to my offer. After that, I'll be talking to the bankruptcy trustees and auction companies. As Margaret walked toward the door, Brennan called after her. Mrs. Whitmore. Why $18 million? You could probably get the place for less at auction. Margaret paused with her hand on the doorknob. Because I'm not vindictive, Mr. Brennan. I'm thorough. Your client wanted to play hardball, so I showed her what hardball actually looks like. But I'm not interested in destroying her, just in protecting what's mine and making sure she never threatens my family's legacy again. She left Brennan sitting alone with the documents that spelled out his client's complete financial ruin. That afternoon, Margaret sat in her kitchen with Harold Jackson and Janet Morrison from Devon Energy, finalizing the details of the mineral rights sale that would fund her land acquisition. The contracts were spread across her grandmother's dining table, next to a pot of coffee and a plate of homemade cookies that seemed absurdly domestic given the magnitude of the business being conducted. The wire transfer will hit your account Thursday morning, Janet said, signing the final page. $47 million for the East Texas mineral rights, with the funds going directly into the escrow account for the Ashford property purchase. Assuming she accepts the offer, Harold added. Margaret glanced out the window toward Victoria's mansion. She'll accept. You sound certain. I had lunch with Sheriff Hawkins today. Interesting conversation. Margaret poured more coffee for her guests. Turns out Mrs. Ashford's been making a lot of enemies in the county, threatening other landowners, trying to manipulate local officials, generally acting like she owns the place. Small towns don't forget that kind of behavior, Harold observed. Exactly. But here's the really interesting part. Apparently she's been having cash flow problems for months. The country club revoked her membership for unpaid dues. Her housekeeper quit because she hadn't been paid in 6 weeks. Even her landscaping service stopped coming. Janet raised an eyebrow. She's broke. Broke and about to be indicted. The FBI agents I spoke with yesterday were very clear about the strength of their case. Wire fraud, racketeering, conspiracy to manipulate property markets. She's looking at serious federal time. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at the screen and smiled. Speak of the devil. Mr. Brennan wants to schedule another meeting. Tomorrow morning. Harold chuckled. Think she's ready to deal. I think she's ready to face reality. Margaret looked out at her repaired fence line. Harold had arranged for a crew to rebuild it stronger than before, using the finest cedar. Posts money could buy. She started this fight thinking she was the biggest predator in the valley. Tomorrow, she's going to learn what it feels like to be prey. That evening, Victoria Ashford stood in her mansion's great room, surrounded by boxes and packing materials. Her designer furniture was being loaded onto trucks by a crew from Dallas, everything valuable enough to sell, everything portable enough to hide from federal asset seizure. Tom Brennan sat on one of the few remaining chairs, watching his clients' world dissolve in real time. The federal prosecutors called this afternoon, he said quietly. They're prepared to file charges Monday morning unless you cooperate fully with their investigation. What kind of cooperation? Complete financial disclosure. Testimony against your co-conspirators in your husband's trading scheme. And he paused, choosing his words carefully. They want you to provide evidence about other wealthy individuals who might have used similar insider trading strategies. Victoria laughed bitterly. They want me to rat out half of Dallas society. It's that or 20 years in federal prison. Victoria walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that had cost her $200,000 and offered a panoramic view of the valley. In the distance, she could see lights in the windows of the Whitmore ranch house, the home of the woman who destroyed her. Life in less than a week. What about the Whitmore offer? 18 million is more than fair, given your situation. It pays off your acceleration clause, covers your legal fees, and leaves you with about 2 million to start over. Start over. Victoria's voice was hollow. I'm 53 years old. Tom. I'm facing federal charges, my reputation is destroyed, and I'm about to lose everything I've built. Where exactly do I start over? Brennan didn't have an answer for that. Victoria's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but something made her answer. Mrs. Ashford. This is Margaret Whitmore. Victoria's blood turned to ice. What do you want? I wanted to speak with you directly, woman to woman, before you make your decision tomorrow. My decision is none of your business. Actually, it is, because what happens next affects both of us. Margaret's voice was calm, almost gentle. Mrs. Ashford, I know you think I'm yo. The closing took place in the marble-floored conference room of First National Bank of Austin, where generations of Texas land deals had been consummated with handshakes and signed papers. Margaret Whitmore sat at one end of the polished table, flanked by Harold Jackson and her attorney, Sarah Chen, a sharp-eyed woman who specialized in complex property transactions. Victoria Ashford sat at the opposite end, looking like a ghost of her former self. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by a simple black pantsuit that had seen better days. Her perfectly styled hair hung limp around her shoulders, and the confident gleam in her eyes had been replaced by the hollow stare of someone who'd lost everything that mattered to her. Between them lay stacks of documents that would transfer. Ownership of 847 acres of prime Texas hill country for $18 million. Money that would barely keep Victoria out of bankruptcy court. Mrs. Ashford, the bank president said gently, if you're ready to sign, we can proceed. Victoria stared at the deed transfer for a long moment, her pen hovering over the signature line. Tom Brennan sat beside her, his usual swagger replaced by the subdued professionalism of a lawyer watching his client's world end. This is really happening, Victoria whispered. I'm afraid so, Brennan replied. Victoria signed her name with swift, angry strokes, as if she could wound the paper itself. Each signature was another piece of her empire being carved away. The ranch deed, the mineral rights transfer, the non-compete agreement that would prevent her from ever returning to Hill County. Margaret watched the process with quiet satisfaction, but no gloating. This wasn't about humiliation, it was about justice. Victoria had tried to steal her family's legacy through intimidation and corruption. Now she was learning that actions had consequences. Mrs. Whitmore, the bank president said, your signature, please. Margaret signed each document carefully, her grandmother's fountain pen flowing smoothly across the paper. With each signature, she reclaimed not just land, but dignity. The Whitmore family ranch would remain intact for another generation. Congratulations, Mrs. Whitmore, Sarah Chen said as the final papers were notarized. You now own 1,347 acres of some of the finest ranch land in Texas. Margaret nodded, but her attention was focused on Victoria, who sat motionless as the reality of her situation sank in. The woman who terrorized her neighbors and tried to manipulate local property markets was now just another person who'd overplayed her hand in Texas. As the meeting broke up, Victoria stood slowly and walked toward the door. She paused beside Margaret's chair, and for a moment, the two women looked at each other directly. I underestimated you, Victoria said quietly. You underestimated a lot of things, Margaret replied, including the fact that money without character is just numbers on a page. Victoria nodded slowly. I suppose it is. She walked out of the conference room without looking back, carrying nothing but a cashier's check and the knowledge that her life in Texas was over. That afternoon, Margaret drove through the gates of what had been the Ashford Ranch, now officially part of her expanded property. Harold Jackson sat beside her in the pickup truck, surveying their new domain with the satisfaction of a man who'd helped orchestrate one of the most complete reversals of fortune he'd ever witnessed. What's the first thing you want to do with the place? Harold asked. Margaret pulled up in front of Victoria's mansion, a gleaming monument to wealth and ego that looked absurdly out of place among the rolling hills and live oak trees. Tear down that monstrosity. Harold chuckled. Kind of a waste, isn't it? Must be worth millions. It's not about the money, Harold. That house represents everything wrong with Victoria Ashford's approach to this land. She built it to dominate the landscape, to show everyone how rich and powerful she was. Margaret stepped out of the truck and walked toward the mansion's front entrance. This land deserves better. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number she'd looked up earlier. Rodriguez Construction, this is Miguel. Mr. Rodriguez, this is Margaret Whitmore. I need a demolition crew. How big a job we talking about, Mrs. Whitmore? Margaret looked up at the mansion's soaring glass walls and pretentious architecture. About 12,000 square feet of bad decisions. 2 weeks later, Margaret stood in the same spot, watching a crew of workers clear away the last debris from Victoria's demolished mansion. In its place, she planned to build something that belonged to the land, a simple ranch house that would serve as headquarters for the expanded Whitmore Ranch operations. Sheriff Hawkins pulled up in his patrol car, stepping out with the easy gait of a man who'd watched justice prevail in his jurisdiction. Heard you're planning to donate some of the land to the county for a park, he said. 200 acres along the creek. Good fishing, nice camping spots. Figured the community should benefit from having the property back in local hands. Hawkins nodded approvingly. Folks around here appreciate what you did, Margaret. Victoria Ashford made a lot of enemies in her short time here. Speaking of which, how did her federal testimony go? FBI agents seemed pleased. Turns out she had a lot to say about insider trading schemes in Dallas energy circles. Word is, her cooperation might keep her out of prison. Margaret felt a surprising lack of satisfaction at that news. Victoria's punishment had never been the point. Protecting her own property had been the goal, and that mission was accomplished. Her phone buzzed with a text from Janet Morrison at Devon Energy. Geological survey complete. Conservative estimate. 60 million cubic feet recoverable gas under your new property. Congratulations on one hell of a land play. Margaret smiled and deleted the message. The natural gas deposits were a bonus, but they weren't why she'd fought so hard to acquire Victoria's ranch. She'd fought to protect her family's legacy and to prove that bullies, no matter how wealthy or connected, couldn't take what didn't belong to them. Harold Jackson walked over from where he'd been supervising the debris removal. Got a call from a reporter at the Austin paper. Wants to do a story about the whole thing. Local rancher outsmarts tech mogul or some such nonsense. Tell him. No thanks. Figured you'd say that. But Margaret, what you did here, it's going to be talked about for years. Small-time rancher takes down a multimillionaire who tried to steal her land. That's the kind of story people remember. Margaret looked out over her expanded property, watching her cattle graze peacefully in pastures that would remain in her family for generations to come. Harold, the only story that matters is the one my grandchildren will tell about how their great-grandmother protected what was theirs. And what story will that be? Margaret walked back toward her truck, ready to return to the ranch house where her grandfather had taught her that land wasn't just property. It was responsibility, legacy, and home. That when someone cut our fence, we didn't just fix it. She said, we made sure nobody would ever cut it again. That evening, Margaret sat on her front porch in the same rocking chair where the story had begun, watching the sun set over land that now stretched as far as she could see. The new fence line, built with the finest materials and strongest posts Harold could find, gleamed in the golden light. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number with a New Mexico area code. Hello. Mrs. Whitmore. This is Victoria Ashford. Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. Mrs. Ashford. I thought you'd left the state. I did. I'm in Santa Fe now, trying to start over. Victoria's voice was different, smaller, humbled in a way that would have been impossible just a month ago. I wanted to call and apologize. For what, specifically? For all of it. For destroying your fence, for trying to intimidate you, for thinking that having money meant I could take whatever I wanted. Victoria paused. You were right about character. I lost sight of mine somewhere along the way. Margaret rocked slowly, in her chair, considering her response. Victoria, I appreciate the apology, but I'm curious, why call now? Because I wanted you to know that what you did, it saved me from something worse than losing my money. You saved me from completely losing myself. Victoria's voice cracked slightly. I was becoming someone I didn't recognize, someone who thought power was more important than decency. If you hadn't stopped me, I don't know what I would have become. Margaret watched her cattle settling in for the night, secure behind fences that would protect them from predators and storms. What will you do now? I bought a small house here. Nothing fancy, but it's mine. I'm thinking about teaching. I have an MBA, and the local community college needs business instructors. Victoria laughed self-consciously. It's not the life I planned, but maybe it's the life I needed. That sounds like a good start. Mrs. Whitmore. Thank you. For fighting back, for showing me what real strength looks like. I know that wasn't your intention, but thank you. After Victoria hung up, Margaret sat in the gathering darkness, thinking about justice and redemption and the strange ways that life sometimes worked out. She'd set out to protect her property and ended up teaching someone an expensive lesson about character. The fence that Victoria had cut in a moment of arrogant rage had been rebuilt stronger than ever. But more importantly, the boundary it represented, between right and wrong, between respectful neighbours and predatory bullies, had been reinforced in a way that would last for generations. Margaret Whittam.